Hey guys, I'd like to talk to you about different types of law today. So this kind of goes along with section 18.2, the homework that you guys did last week. What we're going to talk about is just there are three different types of law. We're going to break each one of those down before we go further. So let's look at it. Before we get to that, the first thing we should know is that all law that we have here in the United States is based off of this idea of common law. And all common law says is that that judges are bound by prior court decisions in similar cases. So for example, if there's a court case about somebody, in the state that you're in, if there's a court case, well, let's take a major Supreme Court case, for example, flag burning, right? There was a flag burning case that went to the Supreme Court, where the justification was that flag burning should be constitutional because it is essentially freedom of speech. And there was another group that said no, it should be illegal because the flag is an important part of what it means to be an American citizen, and that is a desecration of the American flag. So that was a Supreme Court case, Texas versus Johnson. And so and that case was back in 1990, I believe. And so essentially any person after that, right, who had a similar case in which they burned the American flag would have to be ruled the same way. And we'll talk about how they ruled on that case later on. But they would have to rule the same way they did in that Texas versus Johnson case, because that's what fairness, that equates to fairness. If it was ruled one way, it should be ruled a similar way in the future, unless there is a good reason to overturn that previous decision, which sometimes there are. And what common law did was it kind of removed this idea that, for example, kings would often rule on cases. And if you were in good with the king, or if you were in good with a local lord, perhaps in old time England, then essentially you'd be good to go. You'd be covered, and it wouldn't matter if you were at fault or not. So as we said, what we just described with that Texas versus Johnson case is the idea of precedent. Not president, okay? That was previous unit that we went over. Precedent is a different idea. And so when we say precedent, we're talking about previous decisions. So for example, and I know we've mentioned this before, precedent means that if there was a previous decision that was made, it should still apply today. We talked about presidents expanding presidential power over time because of this idea of precedent. So, we use the example of the senior day off after Halloween. That has been a thing, and you guys have understood that it was a thing ever since you've been going to school here. But at one point in time, it wasn't a thing. You were required to come to school on Halloween, and in fact, I remember my first year here, I had a bunch of kids taking a quiz in their Halloween outfits because they were required to be here, right? So in other words, and this is just kind of reinforcing what we talked about before, precedent removes, to a certain extent, just kind of the opinion of judges. So a judge can't look and say, well, I like this person, I like the way this person looks, I like his hair. Then I'm going to rule in his favor. I'm going to rule in favor on his case. A judge cannot do that. So 3 different kinds of law. We're talking about the 3 C's, the constitutional law, civil law, and criminal law. Those are what the 3 C's are. And let's talk about each one. So the first one we'll talk about is constitutional law. And all constitutional law says is that the law cannot conflict with the Constitution. And so there's lots of different examples of this. The case that I will give you that establishes this establishes the concept of judicial review. We've talked about this case before. It's Marbury versus Madison. In that it essentially gave the courts the power to determine, okay, well, what is constitutional and what is not constitutional. And they could look at either laws passed by the legislative branch, or they could look at acts passed, the actions of the president, or maybe an executive order issued by the president. Say, hey, president can't do that. The legislative branch, Congress cannot pass that law. And what it would do, and that's, if you think about it, that's a lot of power, right? So it's going to put the legislative branch, the judicial branch essentially on the same footing as the other 2 branches. So a few examples I'm going to give you. The idea, just abortion, the right of the unborn baby versus the rights of the mother. Separate but equal, meaning this was thought differently at one point in time. You look back to the court case Plessy versus Ferguson. They're going to say that separate but equal, perfectly fine. But then you fast forward several years later, Topeka versus Kansas, they're looking at the same idea and they're changing that idea. Or they're saying, well, separate but equal is not okay. Then you also, perhaps moments of silence at a baseball game or a moment of silence in schools. Why is that a moment of silence instead of a prayer? Well, it's based on our First Amendment rights, and it's this idea that religion should not interfere with government or the just overall patriotism of the country. So, another idea, civil law, regulating disputes between citizens. Nobody's breaking the law here, and that's important it's an important distinction between this and criminal law. The civil law, these are 100% of the cases you'll see on Judge Judy. Those will be civil law type cases. Somebody has wronged somebody else personally, whether it's a failure to pay or damage to property. Accidents happen. It's not breaking the law, but it's certainly they can require some sort of compensation. So we should be fairly familiar with that. Civil law or civil cases can evolve from traffic accidents. There can be criminal and civil dynamics there. They can arise from disputes over property boundaries, for example, or maybe somebody's tree is hanging over somebody's pool, okay? Or maybe, and so I bring up the cartoon there. This was this cartoon here, SpongeBob. Maybe it's a restraining order. Maybe Squidward is making or giving SpongeBob a restraining order to stay away from his property. So these would be examples of civil law. A case that you might look at, it essentially forces somebody to do something, it compels them to do something, either payment for damages or to cut down the tree that's hanging over the pool, or to keep a certain distance from the person to whom you have a restraining order. Example, Walker versus Gill. So this is going to be it can involve the federal or the state government, but what you'll see in this case is very often it's between 2 private parties. So the first person mentioned is going to be the plaintiff, the second person mentioned, is going to be the defendant, and they both have a direct interest in the case at hand. And we're going to skip over that. We're going to go straight here. So, the purpose of criminal law is to determine punishment for the wrong against the public. So, in this case, instead of two private parties being the plaintiff, you're always either going to have the state government or the federal government as the plaintiff in the case against a private party. So, for example, that might be United States versus Walker, if it is a federal crime we're talking about. It results in crimes or imprisonment, and there are several examples of this. It could be murder, it could be robbery, it could be theft, it could be any number of different things. So there are two different types of criminal cases. You have a misdemeanor and then you have a felony. Okay, so a misdemeanor is a lesser crime with less severe sentencing, and a felony is a greater crime with greater sentencing. So different examples that you might see here: traffic violation or underage drinking, a felony more severe, higher sentencing, murder, robbery, assault, those sorts of things that kind of carry more weight there. And that is it for this section of notes. So go ahead and get this bit down here. And I believe the next part we go through is 18.3. We're moving pretty quickly through our unit on the judicial branch. I'll get to you about what your next homework assignment is tomorrow.